is Leslie Briner, and Leslie and I have been friends for 8 years, and over that time she has provided so much wisdom to me from her life, both professionally and personally, what she offers the world and the work that she chooses to do. And I've been really excited to have her speak at Love Church. And when we made the schedule, we didn't even realize it was Easter. And but I'm so honored that she's here, and I'm really excited for her to share with us her very unique perspective. And with that, bring out Leslie.
Hi everyone. She was just sitting right You don't need that chair, right? I can use this chair. Fantastic. Brilliant. Because either I have to put my glasses on so I can read the notes, and the notes have to come closer to me. That's the only way this is going to work. So, nice to see you all. Thank you for being here. Thank you, Sherry. So, what I do in the world is talk about a really sad thing. And so, I'm not going to do that because it's a beautiful day, and it's a Sunday afternoon, and there is a different way to talk about this. But I do want to open with a little bit of a story about how I got involved in the work that I'm in as a way to set some context for why I think I have something worth sharing with you about the nature of trauma and healing from trauma. So my mother, wonderful, wonderful woman that she is, likes to say that I was born a social worker. And she's not wrong. I probably was. I started doing social work very young and have continued to do it professionally, vocationally, and as my heart's pursuit. And after doing a number of other things, I responded to an ad in 2005 in San Francisco, California, where I'm originally from, for an organization called SAGE, which is Standing Against Global Exploitation. Now, at the time, I was very interested in this idea of human trafficking, right? And I didn't really understand, and I'm not going to get into all of the politics of what that means, but really what this agency that I went to work for was an agency that was founded and run by women who had exited prostitution and the commercial sex trades. So in this agency of 50 people, they were all survivors. They were all individuals, mostly women who had left or were leaving this particular lifestyle and this particular kind of trauma. And so I got an amazing opportunity in 2005 to be hired, and they hired me for one very bureaucratic reason, which was that they needed somebody on paper who could pass a background check. I'm not kidding you. They would never have hired a non-survivor to do, especially the job that I had, if any of them could have legally gotten through the licensing process in the state of California. There was an ongoing joke that the leader of our agency wasn't legally allowed to walk through the front door of the housing program that we started. So here's me, very privileged girl from the East Bay, knew nothing about what I was walking into. And so the founder, Norma Hataling, called me into her office pretty early on, and she said, Leslie, you have, and I'm paraphrasing a little bit, but she said, you have the privilege of access, right? People are going to listen to you differently than they listen to us as survivors. And so you need to go out in the world and get the language changed. We've got to call this something different, because until we change the language, they'll just be child prostitutes, and nobody will care about them. And my bleeding liberal heart was like, what do you mean we wouldn't care? Like, that's horrifying. Like, how could you not care about people doing this kind of harm to children? This was just unbelievable to me. And then I went down to San Francisco County Juvenile a couple days later, and I met with the first young person that I would work with for the last 15 years. And she had just turned 13. Nobody with the power of sight possibly could have ever imagined that this young person was anywhere near adulthood, right? She looked like a child. And she was in on her third prostitution charge. And at any given time, 85% of the girls on the girls' unit in San Francisco County Juvenile were in on prostitution charges. And I sat across from her, and like, her own life story was one thing, but the thing that really blew my mind was how all the adults could have interacted with this child and thought that the appropriate response was to put her in a jail cell. So I, being the very self-righteous person that I am and was at the time, was like, I'm gonna find out who her defense attorney is. Now, at that point in my life, I had seen enough Law and Order to be fairly dangerous, right? People who have known me a long time know that level of Law and Order is no joke. So I figured out who her defense attorney was, and I went and I visited this person, and I said, hi, I'm Leslie, I work for SAGE, I'm here to talk to you about this young person, and I wanted to know what your strategy is going to be to defend her because she can't consent. She's 13 years old, she can't consent to the underlying thing that is prostitution. And the response from her defense attorney, right, the person whose job it was to defend her in court from these charges, was to laugh out loud in my face. And that was the moment, right? Like Norma saying, hey, you gotta change the language, because until then, nobody's gonna care about this issue, and sitting across from this young person and going like, where were all the grown-ups, and how did they think that this was an appropriate response? But it was that guy laughing in my face that like stoked the passion in my soul. And so making those conditions different is broadly what I have done for the last 15 years. And so one of the things that has given me a tremendous opportunity to do is to witness a lot of trauma and a lot of resilience and a lot of what works and doesn't work to help bring people back from traumatic experiences or traumatic conditions. And that's a little bit about what I wanted to spend the next few moments sharing with you. So I do a lot of training, and one of the things that is very, I need to move. Like, I'm not used to not moving when oh, that's so much better. I should have done that a minute ago. Okay. So one of the things that I do is I teach a lot, right? So I didn't teach a definition of trauma for a very long time, really only until a couple years ago, because I didn't like the definitions that were out there. And it isn't that the definitions that are out there sort of broadly are wrong. It is that, in my opinion, they're woefully incomplete. So I want to share a little bit about what my definition of trauma is. And I promise you, my goal is not here to put anybody in trauma, but in fact to talk about it at a level up here where we can actually think about what it is and then think about what some pathways to healing might look like. So the usual definition you hear of trauma is that it's when an event or experiences or a set of experiences overwhelm your brain and your emotions, your kind of emotion center's ability to cope, right? Ability to regulate. So you hear people talk about traumas being stuck, right? You have a traumatic experience, you get stuck somewhere in your body. But at a neurobiological level, one of the things that happens is I'm going to refer to our survival brain, right, our reptile brain or the amygdala, and your thinking brain, right, or the prefrontal cortex. And one of the things we know from the advancements in neuroscience is that people who experience a lot of trauma live in survival brain a lot. This is an incredibly brilliant and wise evolutionary adaptation, right? The ability to, kind of come down from the trees because we liked beer and we really wanted to learn how to get more of that in our lives, right? Become this like whole civilized, sort of civilized group of people that we are happened because we had this really sophisticated survival mechanism in these primate brains of ours. So that survival system you've probably heard referred to as fight, flight, or freeze, right? Have you ever heard this? Yes, fight, flight, and freeze. We've added a couple recently, which is fight, flight, freeze, appease, right? Which is go along to get along. How many of you know that as a survival strategy? Yep, that's the women. That's and other folks, but I'd say that tends to be a kind of a gendered one. And then dissociate, right? So the ability to endure your conditions and check out is a survival, very wise, very old survival instinct strategy. So people that experience a lot of trauma get stuck in that part of their brain, right? They get stuck in that fight, flight, freeze, appease, dissociate mode. And one of the things that we have to do to learn to come back from that is to figure out how to get our thinking brain back online. And there is a thing that kind of gets misunderstood out in the world right when we use the word trigger. And a trigger is not something that you just don't like, right? That's just something you don't like. A trigger is not something that just makes you uncomfortable. A trigger is actually when your autonomic nervous system kicks in and goes, there's a threat, the bear is coming, we need to flee, right? So if and this is the much older part of our brain, it's way more evolved than the prefrontal cortex. So if your thinking brain was responsible for keeping you alive, and you walked outside into this very busy street, right, where like the cars sometimes drive fast, and this part of your brain is driving, you walk out, and a car is coming, and you go, oh, I see the car, you're dead, right? Survival brain operates 300 times faster, which means survival brain sees that car before your conscious brain ever recognizes it, and it steps you back. So one of the reasons I use that to illustrate is to say, you don't get to control when survival brain is driving. You don't get to be like, no, survival brain, we don't need you right now. Thinking brain is driving, right? It doesn't work that way. you can observe in yourself when survival brain is kicked in, learn how to reground yourself and center, and get your thinking brain back online. But these are autonomic responses to trauma, right? And that's a lot of how most people who define trauma define it. So I use those definitions. I think they're interesting, but I have two others. And I think this is where the more expansive framing of trauma gets more useful. So the second part of the definition is that it's the interruption, the harmful interruption, or trauma is the harmful interruption, of safety, agency, dignity, and belonging, right? So in the West, especially in sort of the liberal culture, we've told the story that trauma breaks your brain, and the way to go fix your brain is to do some cognitive behavioral therapy or some other evidence-based intervention, or to take or use psychotropic or pharmaceutical drugs or something, and that your brain is broken. And what I want to offer is that your brain is not broken. Your brain has been hardwired over tens of thousands of years to actually respond in some brilliant and sophisticated ways. What is broken is the society that we're in not offering a lot more pathways to healing. There's a great quote, and I'm not going to remember the person's name right there, but say, don't ask what's in your brain, ask what your brain is in. And so that is a way to think about, like, what are the conditions out in the world under which you can or cannot be well. So I define safety not just as physical safety, but also as emotional and psychological safety, being free from violence, harm, coercion, manipulation. Also financial safety. So anybody that has ever experienced or been around poverty knows that poverty is a deeply unsafe set of circumstances, and people do a lot of unsafe things to either maintain financial safety or to obtain financial resources. I also include community safety, right? And that means to be free from violence from the community, from the state, from corporate and environmental degradation. There are communities among us that calling the cops does not make them any safer, right? So the idea that, like, safety is about my physical body and that trauma interrupts that is really still kind of a shallow understanding of what that is. The last part of the trauma definition is that trauma can be individual, collective, systemic, intergenerational, and or historical. And this was the piece that really sort of cracked open my framework, right? Because we live in a highly, highly, highly individuated society, right? We tell the story that an individual person has an individual traumatic experience, they have an individual set of trauma responses, and then they probably go to an individual therapist and sit in an individual room and have individual sessions of cognitive behavioral therapy or whatever else is going on. And I believe, and I've worked with a lot of young people who the harm that happened to them in groups, is that trauma that is inflicted collectively actually has to be healed collectively. And trauma that is inflicted systemically through systems has to be healed at a systemic level. Trauma that occurs intergenerationally has to be healed generationally. The trauma that happens historically has to be healed at a larger cultural level. And if you're not sure what the definition of historical trauma is, that's its whole own other real talk for another day. I do want to note that I did put a resource list in the back, so if you're like, where is all this stuff she's talking about coming from? I did actually try to provide a resource list for that. So what does this larger framework mean, right? So yes, the brain is impacted by trauma, and there's things that we can do to help understand how our brain works and reprogram some things. There is the interruption of those fundamental needs, right, of belonging and dignity, right, having a real sense of self and sense of self-worth, believing that your self-worth is never, ever, ever on the table. Agency is really understanding that you can have some control in your life, right, that you can act on things that will, kind of create and be able to create and sustain the reality that you want for yourself. So would anybody willing to give up dignity for the rest of your life? No? Love and belonging, anybody willing to give that up?
Nobody.
No. What about safety, right? Or what about agency and some sense of control over your life? So do we agree that these are fundamental needs of all human beings? So what trauma does is it forces us to sort of give up one to meet the other a lot, right? And there's lots of ways we can operationalize that, but that's just sort of at the definitional level how it talks. So what this expansive framework offered me was a lens to look at the folks I was working with and go, oh God, we don't know what we're doing, right? Like, and I am a social work professor at the UW School of Social Work, and so I teach social work, and I have a graduate degree in social work, and I've studied this for a really long time. Let me tell you, the people out there doing a lot of clinical work are doing their best with the tools and knowledge and skills they were given, but we are all doing this with a blindfold and one hand tied behind our back right now. right? We are not having a large enough framework to really have the expansive set of skills and awareness and perspective to heal each other, right? A lot of that, we were talking about earlier about that reflexive or that virtuous cycle of how you give and receive and give and receive. We're not primed as a society or as a culture to do that. And so I want to talk about what some of those pathways are. The other thing I want to say before I get into that is that I believe in therapy. I really do. I believe it is one of the pathways. It is not the singular pathway. And I believe in better living through chemistry and the fact that pharmaceutical innovations have allowed us to live longer and healthier lives. So this in no way should be heard as a do this instead of, right? I'm offering these additional pathways as a contribution to other things that people do to heal and get well and, and put one foot in front of the other. So what are some of these pathways? Well, the first pathway I talk about is returning to the original medicine. And what I want to point out is that you all did that and talked about that in your sentence stems. The original medicine is music. It is dance, it is movement, it is connecting with nature, it is pleasure and joy. And be that sex or be that cuddling or be that intimacy, right? All of these things that human beings have done to get well, to get grounded, and to stay connected is how we healed each other and healed ourselves for tens of thousands of years, right? Until modernity came along under neoliberalism in particular and was like, no, that's not what we do to heal. If you all do that, you'll rise up in collective action and we'll change the conditions that are causing all the suffering in the first place. And so we'd actually like you to stay small and quiet and broken and traumatized, and here, take a pill for that, right? And again, not picking up if whatever works for you is great, but that is not the conditions that are going to cause us to be able to change the world and make it, A, not burn down, and be a place that is sustainable and loving and fair and just and equitable and all of that. So returning to the original medicine. The second one is developing coping skills, right? And this is the one that sounds a little bit more clinical. So coping skills can be a lot of things. I could talk about that for 8 hours. But start with breath, right? And there's one very important reason to start with breath, right? So if you go back to the stuff about the reptile brain versus the thinking brain, your amygdala is driven by your autonomic nervous system. This is things like your heart rate, your circulation, your reproduction. So anybody ever watch a little kid try to hold their breath, right? And you're like, I get to hold my breath, right? But eventually that survival part of your brain kicks in and is like, you gotta breathe, right? People who try to end their life via asphyxiation have to go to extreme measures, and that's because your will to live will almost always override, your whatever you're trying to do, unless you really do some things to knock that survival brain offline. The one thing that you can control when survival brain is driving is your breath. And that is why it is the trigger to be able to help get your thinking brain back online. And so if you are really in survival mode, the brain's like, oh God, the bear is coming, the harm is coming, the threat is coming, whatever it is, and you have to run, you're not going to be able to sit down and thoughtfully take 4 deep breaths, right? So being able to focus on your breath, and particularly deep grounding breaths, triggers to your brain that we don't actually have to run from the bear right now. We can chill out and maybe let thinking brain drive again. So build coping skills, start with your breath. The other thing I want to offer about coping skills is that building your tolerance for discomfort has to happen when you build coping skills. It can't be like, I'm going to work on all of my stuff, but I don't ever want it to be uncomfortable. That's not going to work, right? We have to build our tolerance for discomfort, and whether or not you're starting at a 1 or you're starting with a 10, whatever the coping skill is going to almost inherently require that you actually have some ability to tolerate discomfort underneath that. The third pathway to healing, and I know this one's going to sound a little cliched, but it's practicing gratitude. The neuroscience on this is actually super clear about how it changes your mood, how it rewires your brain, how it changes your perspective in the long term. And so even if the gremlins have taken over your brain, right, one of the things that will help bring you back to some sort of calm-centered perspective is finding gratitude. Even if that gratitude is I'm just grateful that I can sit here and take 3 deep breaths, that will help bring some grounded awareness back. And then the last pathway that I want to talk about is contributing to a greater good, right? And again, this might sound a little bit pie in the sky, but A lot of history and a lot of culture have taught us that when people contribute to the community around them, be that the small community of their household, or the larger community, or the larger political landscape, that it does in fact have a transformative and healing effect to it. And so, we have to be the change we want to see in the world, right? That's actually, it sort of sounds cliched, but the minute that you take on your own personal sense of agency, right, where you decide, I'm going to build some tolerance for discomfort, I'm going to do my self-care practices, I'm going to figure out what my original medicine is that I need in order to heal and be well, you give permission for everyone else around you to live that way too. There's an amazing quote from a woman named Mary Pfeiffer that says, social change is 1,000,000 acts of kindness, but cultural change is 1,000,000 subversive acts of resistance. So the last little pathway I want to talk about is a term I use, which is tiny revolutions, right? Every single day I try to make little tiny revolutions, and that may be the way I choose to speak or not speak, it may be the way I choose to dress, it may be being kind to myself and writing an affirmation. It may be being really vulnerable and courageous around something that's hard for me to be vulnerable about. But it is the active, moment-by-moment choice to do the different thing and to do the more courageous thing, right? And the more people around you see that, the more you can empower them. So I want to end with a quick story. I have one more minute. Okay, I know the quick story. So after the terrible atrocities in Parkland, Florida, I was listening to a podcast, and there was a psychiatrist talking, and she was a woman that ran a facility for very troubled individuals, and she was basically talking about how a lot of folks that commit crimes like this are not mentally ill. And I'm listening to it, and like at a diagnostic level, I understand what she's talking about, but they were talking about social isolation, right? And she said, and I was so dumbfounded at the moment that I heard this. I got up and wrote it on the dry erase board in my office. And she said, what this young man was afflicted with was social isolation. And social isolation isn't the problem of mental health to fix. Now, as a mental health provider type person, I immediately was like, excuse me, how is that not our problem? And I really chewed on it for a long, long time. And I was really mad at her, actually, for a minute, because I thought she was absolving her responsibility as a mental health practitioner and being like, yeah, we deal with the people that are messed up, but this whole society issue, not our thing. And I'm still not entirely resolved about how I feel about it, but what I've landed here is this. The reason that she's right is because therapists alone will never solve social isolation. Therapists alone will never solve trauma. Therapists alone in the mental health system will never be able to change the conditions that are causing the suffering in the first place. The only people who can do that is us. And so whether or not that pathway is getting back to your original medicine, or learning how to breathe, or learning how to be vulnerable, or taking a walk in nature, or whatever it is, please go find that original medicine, dig into it. Stop giving up your power to a society that is telling us that there is only one way to heal, because it is actually the capacity to heal one another that is really going to be truly transformative. Thank you.